Good evening, good evening. We're going to jump right in here. I'm going to share my screen and we will get started. We'll pop that up there. And tonight, as you know, we are in our 11th session on the Civil War. We took a break last week. Just getting things set up here. Took a break last week. Where we had left off the week before was right in the middle of the Battle of Gettysburg, right in the middle of the crucial year of 1863. Now, as a recap, let me remind you that the journey we've seen is that the struggle between the sections of the country had kind of been set in motion from the beginning. That was our early 4 or 5 sessions where we looked at kind of the early 19th century and the early years of the country and some of the critical decisions that were made by the founders and the generation that came after them regarding how government was to be understood, what they did with slavery, didn't do with slavery. And that led to the moment when Lincoln was elected in 1860, through a series of events in the 1850s that kind of all ran in that kind of road to the Great Crisis that exploded. And even though Lincoln said, hey, look, we don't have to go here. And if you remember, Lincoln was not, I would say is not, an abolitionist and was very content, and the Republican Party generally was content to say, we will not try to stop slavery in the South, but we will want to stop slavery in the future. So in any territories. And it was that sense of denying what the Southerners would have said was their right to go wherever with their property, even though most of them were not going out west. But the idea for them was the final straw, and what was a series of things that from their point of view had felt like a designed attack against them. Of course, many in the North, particularly the abolitionists, but many others in the North also would have said that the South had been having an outsized influence on the country due to the 3/5 decision in the Constitution, and that had led them to the situation. But once that set in motion, the South began building and creating a country and set themselves with a plan that if we can just keep existing, we'll be recognized eventually by countries like England and France who need us and need our cotton. But Lincoln and others in the North were not going to let that stand. They were going to go and act. They were going to move in a very decisive way against a group of people who were determined to use violence if necessary to get their own way. I find a lot of similarities in our current scenario, without trying to cast any one person or group as the equivalent of some other group from the past. That's usually a little dangerous to do, but we can see these patterns. And so you have this similar situation where you have a crisis at various points in the country and questions about what the government should or shouldn't do. So we see this in the Civil War. So that led to war starting in the summer of '61, which had a very minor battle, which you may remember, the first battle we looked at, which we noted was shocking for being how bloody it was, but that we also said by the time you get to '63, that Battle of Bull Run, the first, would feel very, very small and insignificant in comparison. So the year '63 comes after, in my opinion, the war really was over. The Battle of Antietam in 1862, when Lee went out of his way to try to, in essence, replicate the Battle of Saratoga, which would have proven, in his opinion, to England in particular, that they should recognize the Confederate States of America as an independent nation. And England's entry into the war would have changed everything. He loses that battle. McClellan doesn't really win, but he doesn't lose either. And the invasion of the North is stymied. There's no victory for Lee to celebrate. There's no chance in '62 to kind of maybe threaten DC. Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, which changes the entire tenor of the conversations. We noted it didn't free any slaves at all, but it made the entire war about slavery. And that was crucial. And of course, that most importantly made it so that England could not recognize the South. England had, for the 60-something years, had prided itself as the first country to really outlaw slavery and make this kind of brave and bold stance opposing slavery. The last thing they could do would be to recognize a rebellious nation in another country that was centered around slavery. And so, that moment sort of like how Midway is, if you know your World War II history. After the Battle of Midway, really only 6-7 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan should have surrendered. Japan should have negotiated. Not saying that FDR would have negotiated, but once Midway happened, all the initiative lay with the United States, and Japan was on the defensive. And so Antietam is that same sort of moment where, for all intents and purposes, the war is over. There's no way the South will win. And many other historians have noted before, as we saw, so much of the Northern experience was, it was involving in the North. It took effort, but still there was so much of the North that really almost didn't pay attention to the war. And so the South was fully in, the North was somewhat in, meaning had it gotten worse for the North, had there been several defeats of, say, at Antietam or Gettysburg, the North would still have been able to handle this. Okay, so when you go into 63, then what's happening? Why is the South fighting? Well, one, because the South's not going to give up. And two, you may remember we looked at, and we'll look at it again in a moment, the idea of what was the battle plans or the strategy of the Confederacy. And theirs was to exist, but we noted there was a major flaw in that, and that they really didn't need to exist. They needed to make the war miserable for the North. And now that 63 is in view, that means the election of 64 is in view. So if we, from the South's point of view, if we can't convince the North or Lincoln to negotiate, and we can't convince them to quit fighting, if we can make it seem impossible to win, then maybe Lincoln will lose the 64 election and a new president will come in who would negotiate. That was there's flaws with that logic, but that was their thought process. That was what they were shooting for. And so then that led us into what becomes really total war. Now we're going to talk about this more next week because it's more famously seen after Sherman leaves Atlanta. But the idea of total war really begins to grip. And as I've said a couple of times in this series, the U.S. Civil War is, to me, the first modern war. We all know of World War I. It's often held up as kind of this first modern war, and I get that. But all the precursors of World War I, both in military technology, but also in kind of the idea of the totality of the experience, is seen in the U.S. Civil War, and in particular in the South, but even in the North by 63 and 64, as industry continues to ramp up, you get this experience. So there's our kind of context, that 63 was the year in which you went away from single little battles happening in single little places to a year of conflict, just from beginning to end. So Grant and Sherman are marching on Vicksburg in December of 62, and will continue the pressure, as we saw all the way through the spring, until Grant makes his masterful move, cutting his supply line, coming to the South from the Louisiana side, and then being able to get to Jackson, Mississippi, and then envelop Vicksburg. Well, in the meantime, you have in the back east, you have a new commander in Joe Hooker. He begins in the spring to march on Richmond, in essence, and gets into the Battle of Chancellorsville in a place called the Wilderness Woods near Fredericksburg. Lee wins that battle, often seen as Lee's finest hour, and then realizes we can't just stay here. We're going to have to take the fight to the north again. Jefferson Davis wants Lee to go to Mississippi. Lee's like, nope, not doing that. I think I can save Vicksburg by going north. And so that idea is kind of where we found ourselves. And in that march north, we saw Lee makes his way past Maryland, doesn't waste any time, really fulfills what he said he wanted to do in 62. Hooker is still the commander. He's following Lee, and they kind of make their way into Pennsylvania. Now, along the way, Hooker messes up with Lincoln, and he gets replaced as the lead general. That's not the end of Hooker. Men like Hooker and Burnside, as we'll see, they'll still be fighting. You're going to see Hooker's name in just a minute. Hooker will end up out west. There's other places where he and Burnside and others that we've met before will continue to be in the Army. Not always does that happen. McClellan never comes back. Meade takes over. George Meade And it's good that Meade took over, and he's done well. So at the Battle of Gettysburg is where we left off. Now, when they get to that battle, as we saw, there wasn't a planned battle for that location, although the ground there would make for a good battle, because the Union was able to hold the better ground. It's high, it's not really high ground as we saw from some of the pictures. Because of that, Longstreet's like, we need to get out of here. Now remember, Stonewall Jackson was killed at the Battle of Chancellorsville. So now there's Lee, and then there's Longstreet and Jackson. And those are kind of his main guys. Jeb Stuart takes care of the cavalry. Those are his main fighting groups within the Army of Northern Virginia, Lee's army. He's lost Jackson. So Longstreet's his only one, still with him. And Longstreet tries to convince Lee, this is not good for us. But for whatever reason, Lee was refusing to take Longstreet's advice. So as well as we would say Chancellorsville, and I would suggest Antietam, are Lee's finest hours. He's going to go from the great victory and success of Chancellorsville to his worst possible 3 days here in July in Pennsylvania. Lee is a terrible general at this point. He makes mistake after mistake. He has men let him down. So Ewell on day one fails to take the high ground of Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill. Jeb Stuart took the cavalry and a little bit of a snit and rode away. And so Lee doesn't know where anybody is. He told his generals not to get in a general engagement, but they do. And now here's Longstreet saying, hey, don't do this. Lee's like, we're going to do it anyway. So on day two, he gave Longstreet the order to shift the battle to the far south. Longstreet kind of pouts and doesn't do it fast enough. And so ultimately that led to the big battle. You can see here on this map right here. Whoops, go back there. Right here on this map here, the battle for Little Round Top, in which at the very last minute, Sickles' controversial move to march his forces out, and you can see on this map down here where this little red line is, the blue line's nice and straight for day three, but on day two, Sickles marched out there. He didn't like being on low ground, and that was a controversial move, and he was criticized for it. However, it alerted Meade to what Longstreet was doing, and that led to a very famous battle up here on Little Round Top, in which Strong Vincent's brigade is able to hold the Little Round Top, and of course, most famously, Joshua Chamberlain and the 20th Maine ended up on the end of the line here, and they hold down against the charging forces of the Confederacy. There's several charges up and back and forth on the hill. Eventually, the 20th Maine and some of the other brigades of the regiments there, they run out of ammunition, and so finally, Chamberlain orders a very shocking, fixed bayonets, we're going to charge down the hill at them. They've got to be tired too. And his movement to charge down the hill, broke the Confederate attack, and eventually they all retreated off. So day three left us, that's where we left off, right here on this picture in this map here in the bottom right. And so Lee thinks, again, Longstreet says, we need to get out of here. This has been a disaster. We're still not broken though. If we will break off and pull away, they have to follow us. And Longstreet, of course, is right. Lee, though, again, worst possible 3 days he could have. This is the worst of all. He believed it would be possible for them to make one final attack. He thought, our army's never been defeated. The boys are brave. And he had one division under Longstreet by George Pickett, who had not been involved. And so he's like, look, we can charge across the field and we'll break their line, because they would have, the Union would have defended and reinforced the top. Now, if you remember our discussion in Antietam, one of the things that Lee had in his advantage at Antietam was interior lines. And at that place, McClellan was the one on the outside fighting around. Well, if you look at the map, you can clearly see who has interior lines. It's Meade and the Union Army. So not only is Lee making the mistake of attacking an entrenched force slightly uphill, but he's attacking a force that has interior lines. Even if Meade had reinforced his wings and the center was weak, which it was not, Meade would be able to more quickly maneuver forces to stop any charge Lee would have. It's obvious when you stand on the ground what a dumb idea this is. You can look at this and you can say, okay, wait, we have to walk all the way across. That's roughly a mile from here past that house to those trees up there. There's a road in the middle and there were fences at the time, so you couldn't even run. I mean, you could run some of it, but you're gonna have to climb over a fence or take the fence down. those aren't fences that'll come down easily. It's a disaster. And if you look from the Union side, you can see how easy it is to shoot at these people. And when I was there last, there was a reenactor who was there, and he showed me this picture that his group of reenactors had come up with based on the implant, where they knew the artillery was implanted. So this is just the artillery guns of the Union. And most of us who are on this call and who are listening have never been in battle. A few of you are veterans and you know this, but just looking at that line, there's no way that I'm going to walk from up here on the top. So this is where Seminary Ridge is, and walk across there in the face of that artillery and make it alive, let alone all the guys shooting their rifles at me. So when you see this field and you think, what in the world was Lee thinking? And I guess, everybody has a bad day. And unfortunately for Lee and the Confederacy, this was his bad day, because the march across the field, while glorious, people like to talk about it, it's so pretty, and yay for the South and all their flags, and men in the North in later years were writing about how beautiful it was and all this kind. It was a dumb decision. It was as bad as what the Union had done at Fredericksburg the December before, charging again and again and again into entrenched positions. The Union Army was ready for them. And as soon as Lee thought he could win an artillery barrage contest, he could knock out their guns. Well, again, who's got the most guns? Who has the most ammunition? Well, the Union does. And eventually his commander gets word to him. It's like, I can't keep shooting. I'll have no ammunition left to try to protect the forces when they start marching. So no guns were knocked out. It was a disaster. The group that goes, over 60% casualties. Pickett lives and hated Lee for the rest of his life. Now, he will stay with the Army, but if you ever ask him about Lee, he was no longer a fan. Lee, after they're all streaming back, Lee's like, oh, it's all my fault, but we need to get ready for a counterattack. And he says, General Pickett, where's your army? Reform your division. And Pickett famously said, I have no division. And he hated Lee for the rest of his life. It was a disaster. Now, Meade does not follow up. Same mistake McClellan made. In Meade's defense, he didn't have 20 to 25,000 troops kind of hanging out, a mile from the battlefield where nobody was involved. He did have some troops on reserve, but everybody basically was involved. So on July 4th, he does not attack Lee. He just rests. He knew it was close, and it was close. It wasn't like this was a blowout battle. You could almost say this was kind of a draw up to Pickett's charge. And after Pickett's charge, the numbers are all against the Confederacy in the loss. So July 4th and 5th becomes worse because this is what happens in Vicksburg. Unbeknownst, obviously, to Lee, at the same time, through the latter, say, week and a half, Grant's forces had been digging trenches underground, caves almost, underground, to get underneath the embankments and the kind of defensiveness that they would have, not like walls, it's not like castle walls, but it's kind of like deep defensive trenches that they would have. And they blew one, didn't really work. They blew another one. And so this guy in charge of his engineer said, look, we're going to do all 13 at once. And so they set in motion for the first days of July to put these explosives. Well, I don't know whether Pemberton figured it out or not, but nonetheless, the last 2 weeks have been a disaster. Like I told you last time, if God forbid we're ever attacked, you're somewhere where real war is going on and an army's coming close to the city where you live, get out. Just don't think you can make it through that. They were eating rats and dogs and chewing leather and making tea from, shells of walnuts. I mean, it was disastrous for the people of Vicksburg. And finally, Pemberton on the same day, July 3rd, rides out and says to Grant, I want to surrender. Grant gives his very famous, traditional, unconditional, no conditions. Pemberton spins around. Grant realizes, okay, we can win this battle if we attack them, but do I really want to do that? I mean, it's going to be costly. I'm going to lose a bunch of people. So that evening, he sends word to Pemberton that he would have a few possible suggestions, give up their weapons, everybody go home, basically. Now, Grant was criticized by this from some people because he should have, captured the whole army and send them up north. But Grant reasoned that what he had seen by being in Mississippi now for, almost now 4 months, was that most people in the South were tired of the war. There was no evidence they were winning. And so he surmised that if he let them go back and kind of go home on parole, meaning you won't come back and join, most of them would not come back and join, or some would, but most would not. And it'd be cheaper than sending them to a POW camp in the north. That'd be expensive. They'd die. It'd be terrible. So on July 4th, the city surrenders. So July 3rd, Lee loses with Pickett's charge. July 4th, Vicksburg surrenders. And, if you can't see that we're winning, you're not looking. Of course, if you checked the northern papers at this point, you'd still have thought we were losing. I like the way Lincoln says it when he got word from Grant, the father of waters goes unvexed to the sea. Obviously, the citizens of Vicksburg, they did not think it was a good thing. And as you can see, for 80 plus years, they did not celebrate July 4th in Vicksburg. And even after Eisenhower came in 1946, they didn't celebrate in 46. It wasn't really to the 50s and maybe even the 60s that they finally started having yearly celebrations of it. It was just bitter for them, understandably so. So this would seemingly put us in a position where all things were good. However, there's still more war going on in 64. In Tennessee, there were two smaller armies that had been engaged with each other from, again, December, January, all the way through the same time. They were led by men, and for the Union, Rosecrans, and for the Confederacy, Bragg. Now, Grant at this point is thinking about attacking Mobile. So he's just going about his business, maybe sending some troops off into Louisiana, over to Texas, but really thinking about Mobile. Lincoln's not sure what he wants to do with Grant, but he doesn't want him to go off to Texas, that's for sure. And so in the process, there's a battle in which Rosecrans and the Union are successfully able to maneuver Bragg out of Tennessee. When he gets him out of Tennessee, he was pretty confident that Bragg was just retreating to Atlanta. So he just sort of let his army loosely follow past Tennessee. Now, this is where I'm from originally. In fact, if you look at the river, the Tennessee River going up here, there's Knoxville. My home is right here, equidistant, about 55 miles between Chattanooga and Knoxville. So I grew up on that river in the foothills of the Smokies. And so I know it very well. Now here we talk about ridges, we're talking about real ridges, real hills, real mountains. Well, Bragg catches Rosecrans by surprise in counterattacking in mid-September at a small little river, basically, south of Chattanooga called Chickamauga. And he's successful. And so Rosecrans retreats back into the city. And all of a sudden, there's a problem, because if Rosecrans or Chattanooga falls, it's possible that Tennessee could be opened up as a new battlefield again. Davis and Lee had sent Longstreet over to East Tennessee. Now this, I often say, was slightly punishment to get Longstreet and Lee. They were mad at each other. Again, Pickett was mad. So it was just easier for Davis to, let's just let Longstreet go away. Meade was not attacking Lee. So it's like, we'll just let him go away. And so he goes over, and when Longstreet shows up to participate in the Chickamauga battle, obviously the Virginians were a nice addition for Bragg, and they were successful. And so they bottled up Rosecrans in Chattanooga. This was Lincoln's moment. He realizes, I need Grant. So he makes Grant commander-in-chief of the all-Western armies, takes them out of control of anybody else. It says, do what you got to do to save Chattanooga. So he immediately gets rid of Rosecrans. The one guy who fought well, his unit fought well, his army fought well, was Thomas. And he makes Thomas the commander of the army. He brings Sherman. He sends Sherman orders, you need to get here as soon as possible. It'll take Sherman not till early November that he gets there. Grant will get there in October. And Hooker, who I already mentioned we'd see again, was sent from the east with another kind of army group to come over and join and kind of bolster Grant's forces. The first thing Grant needed to do when he got there was get supplies. And he and the engineer in charge for the army that was there in Tennessee, a man named Baldy Smith, created what was called the Cracker Line. But just want you to get this, right? They're there, they're kind of surrounded. It's for 2 or 3 weeks, they're not eating. It's like, oh, we're in the same siege that Vicksburg was in. Grant shows up 5 days later, they've got a line of supply open. So just that quick, his decisiveness of what needed to happen, gave everybody comfort. In fact, there's several reports from different soldiers who, when Grant arrived, there was a sense of somebody's in charge. We're okay. We're going to be safe. We're going to make it. And Grant, of course, immediately begins making plans to counterattack. This is Grant's way. He's not going to sit and wait. And so even before he had numerical advantage, in fact, this is one of the battles in which the Confederacy has a numerical advantage. Now, they get to bickering amongst themselves. Longstreet was unhappy just generally because of him being sent over there, and he finally is given permission, but takes his division and goes to Knoxville, which would obviously be the way back home to Virginia. But he's like, well, we'll capture Knoxville on the way, which sounds nice, but you haven't captured Chattanooga yet. And so they lost their numerical advantage. And then in November, as you can see, Sherman arrives with his army. And at this point, Grant has already laid out a very clear plan of what he needed to do and where he was going to do it. And the plan was, and all happens around Thanksgiving, was to envelop the line. So now in here you see Missionary Ridge and Lookout Mountain. We're talking about real ridges and real mountains. So it's not an easy climb, not the little hill like we saw back at Gettysburg. And so Bragg's position was seemingly unassailable from the front. So Grant wisely thought, well, we'll sweep around the two sides. Hooker would go, as you can see there, to the west, up Lookout Mountain, and Sherman would go up to the top part of the Missionary Ridge and be able to come up the slopes, basically, from the Tennessee River. Great plan. It's a little challenging to execute over mountains and ridges. If you've ever been to Chattanooga, you know what I'm talking about. So on the 23rd, Thomas's army first takes the bottom of Missionary Ridge, which forced the Confederacy up higher, which was to Grant's advantage. Then on the 24th, Hooker successfully captures Lookout Mountain. There's moments where it's all kind of foggy. It's called the Smoky Mountains for a reason, and there's a lot of fog, and you couldn't see things, but eventually they saw the American flag waving from Lookout Mountain, and they knew that they had won that battle. And then on the 25th, the plan was to sweep around. Well, it's actually not as easy as it looks on this map to go from Lookout Mountain to the bottom part of the ridge, kind of down here. And Sherman actually ended up on the wrong ridge for his part. So he had to go up and come down and go up again. It's just kind of a misstep on Sherman's part and his troops. So it looked like it wasn't going to work. And so finally, Thomas got permission to advance a little further. Now, the idea was just to go a little further. Now, Thomas's army was the men who had been beaten at Chickamauga. So put this in your mind, right? Here comes Hooker with some Eastern guys, and they don't, of course, have a great track record, but still, they didn't lose their last battle. And, of course, Sherman bringing his part of the army from the west that had just captured Vicksburg, and, of course, Grant. And so the boys in Chattanooga, who were Thomas's army, there was a sense in which they were kind of like, wow, we're kind of embarrassed. And so when Thomas gave them permission to attack, now again, it's a frontal attack, and this time it is really uphill. But they marched with such alacrity and energy that they surprised Bragg's forces, who obviously did not expect to be attacked uphill. And again, I wish I could show you a picture. We're talking like up a mountain. And so they just did not think they would be attacked that direction. And yet the Union forces swept forward. In fact, at one point, Grant says to Thomas, wait, who gave those guys permission to keep going? And Thomas is like, I don't know, wasn't me. But of course, he's beaming inside because there goes his boys. And they just marched up the ridge. And before long, Bragg and his entire army is flooding back to Atlanta. And this time, they don't stop and try to have a counterattack. They just race all the way back, basically to around Dalton, Georgia, and kind of hit out there. At this moment, Lincoln knows, I've got my general. Do you remember this slide? I showed you this slide back week 5 or week 6 when we were looking at the battle plans. And I showed you the quote from Lincoln from Fredericksburg in December 1862, when Burnside was so destroyed at that battle. And it's been one loss after the other and one general tried after another. And Lincoln says famously, no general yet found that can face the arithmetic. And what he meant was, we have more forces in the North than the South. And if we will simply press our attack, now you can't have battles like Fredericksburg, but if you can fight a battle, even if you take a few more losses and then keep pressing, Lincoln's understanding, certainly by December of 62, was that there's no way the South can protect itself and regenerate more soldiers. Nobody's coming to their aid, nobody like England or France. They're on their own. They eventually will run out of people. And so he now has found his man, and that's going to be Ulysses S. Grant. Grant's victory in Chattanooga, and this is a very famous picture of them up on Lookout Mountain, and you get a little bit of a visual of how, we're talking about a real hill. That's Grant down here in this spot, and those are some of his generals right here. Grant was going to be the man who could take us to victory. Congress was so excited that they reinstated the rank of lieutenant general, which was last held by Washington. They do this in February of '64. And Grant's given orders to come to D.C. Excuse me. He doesn't want to do it. He wants to stay in the West. In fact, before Chattanooga, after Vicksburg, they had talked about him coming to the East. He's like, nope, don't want to do that. He really understood that he had created a really smooth and well-oiled machine with men like Sherman and Sheridan. And he was going to work really well with his team and his army and his generals and his soldiers. And in the East, they didn't know him. There's some generals to be mad about getting promoted over. But this time he knew he couldn't avoid it. And so he accepts it. He gets, again, the rank of lieutenant general. By being given that rank, it makes him a commander-in-chief. When he gets to D.C., and I'm going to read you some quotes about Grant, just because I just really like Grant. Grant's, I think, the epitome of what we really wish for in our leaders, in that he's a guy, perhaps, that we haven't seen since George Washington, who literally did not want to be the guy. He didn't want to be a politician, for sure. And he wasn't trying to have a lot of fanfare, wasn't trying to show off. He just wanted to get the job done. And then because of that, and because he showed his quality, he had his success rise up. Unlike many in the political realm, and even generals in this kind of moment where you have political generals who are advanced because of who they know, as opposed to their quality. And so, Grant, Lincoln says this about him. He's the quietest little fellow you ever saw, right? Grant shows up in D.C. unannounced. I mean, they knew he was coming. He goes to one of the very famous hotels, goes to check in. The guy's like, well, we only have a room on the top floor. He's got his son with him. He's like, that's fine. And he signs the registry, U.S. Grant and son Tad. Right? Well, when the clerk sees it, he knows who Grant's name is. He freaks out. He gives him the biggest suite. Word gets to Lincoln he's in town. I mean, Grant's just that kind of guy. He's very laid back. Meade assumed he's going to be fired. And so when he meets Grant, this is what he said to his right. He said, you need to rest assured that he, Grant, is not an ordinary man. So even Meade recognized in Grant that, my goodness, that there's someone that's different. Later, I'll read you some other quotes here. At one point, Grant, when he's working on his plans, gets kind of sideways with Stanton, who is Secretary of War. So Secretary of War Stanton had kind of been overseeing the whole thing, and he thought, hey, look, I need to sign off on this stuff. And Grant's like, let's go see Lincoln. And when he goes to see Lincoln, Lincoln says this, you and I, Mr. Stanton, have been trying to boss this job, and we've not succeeded very well with it. We have sent across the mountains for Mr. Grant to relieve us, and I think we'd better leave him alone to do as he pleases. So there's already this recognition. Later, I love this when Longstreet is asked. So they find out in the South what's happening. Now, Longstreet and Grant had been friends before the war. They'll be friends after the war. They were in each other's weddings. And so Longstreet's asked about him, and he said, well, we must make up our minds to get into line of battle and stay there, for that man will fight us every day and every hour till the end of this war. Longstreet understood that Grant understood the advantages were all with him. Some of the soldiers reported saying this when they first met him. They go, a Wisconsin veteran said, he looks as if he means it. He didn't talk a lot like puffery, like braggadocious. He just looked like he was serious. And of course, we've already seen that at the Battle of Shiloh. Another guy from New England wrote, we all felt at last that the boss had arrived. Lincoln gave a report to a newspaper man and through his press secretary. And Lincoln says this. He said, Grant is the first general I've had. He's a general. I'll tell you what I mean. You know how it's been with all the rest. As soon as I put a man in command of the army, he'd come to me with the plan of a campaign, and about as much as saying, "Now, I don't think I can do it, but if you want me to try, I'll try it." He said, they all wanted me to be the general, meaning Lincoln. It isn't so with Grant. He hasn't told me what his plans are. I don't know. I don't want to know. I'm glad to find a man who will go on and fight without me. So Lincoln has found his man, and we've already seen this kind of building with Grant, that Grant knows what he wants to do. He immediately promotes Sherman to be in charge of the Western Army, basically take his spot. And he sets in motion a 5, there's actually a 6th, should be a 6th arrow coming from West Virginia, plan in which what he wants to do is attack the Confederacy all at once. Now, to give some nod to McClellan, as you may remember, had a similar plan back in '62. But this was really A, before the Army of the North was ready to do this, and B, McClellan was not Grant. McClellan did not have his own initiative to really pull this off. So the plan was really, really simple to coordinate. You can see there's almost a 4-to-1 or certainly a 3-to-1 odds of numerical superiority. Again, being able to do the math. Lincoln wants a general who's not going to be afraid to fight. Grant writes Sherman and says, we're going to concentrate all the force possible against the main Confederate armies in the field with a simultaneous movement along the line. Meaning there'll be no way for Davis, Lee to send any reinforcements to each other. None of this one attack and then go home, another one attack and go home. We're going to attack all at once. And by pressing all at once across the full breadth of the Confederacy, they'll break. They will not be able to stand up. Now, that sounds good. It's going to still be a struggle. And it's going to be a struggle mostly because the Eastern Army in particular was dealing with political bureaucracy. That's the nicest way to put it. They had massive bloat. You've all worked places. You've seen a bureaucratic bloat where all of a sudden there's like 5, 6, 7 assistants to every person. There's 4 vice presidents, assistants to the vice president. Before long, you've got so many people on the administrative staff, you don't have people doing the work. That was the Union Army. Most of the Eastern generals, the guys in charge, were there because of political appointments that Lincoln felt like he had to make to keep people happy, but that's not going to be what you need on the battlefield. And as we'd said, Grant had really kind of created the Western Army to be an extension of himself. Move hard, move fast, take initiative. You see an opportunity, go for it. In fact, if you know, again, World War II, often what's said about the U.S. Army compared to particularly the German Army, but in the Japanese Army as well, in 44 and into 45, 43 into 45, is that the U.S. soldiers and the lieutenants and the captains who were there on the ground really were given a lot of freedom to kind of move forward and make decisions and kind of shift on the fly and be able to press the attack where the advantage lay. And that's the Army Grant had built, but that was not the East. The East was not like that at all. There's a very famous story when Grant was still organizing things. The guy who was going to be one of the major quartermasters had somebody wanted to ask Grant. They knew each other from before the war. Well, he gets all dressed up in his finest uniform, gets, with his retinue to go see, the new general, and everything it had always been in the forward in the East had been one where you really had to be fancy and formal. Well, he's on his way to meet Grant, and all of a sudden he sees Grant on his horse on the way. And they stop, and of course they're friends, and Grant shakes his hand, they get down off the horse, he gets out of the wagon. It's muddy, there's a little rain, people are going by, they're getting splattered with mud. And the guy's like, well, I really want to talk to you. And what he was saying was, let's go to your command headquarters. And Grant's like, well, let's talk now. And they just talked right there and got it all out. When he got back on his wagon, he was filthy. When he gets back to his headquarters, he goes to see Meade because they've been working with Meade. He goes, this guy's serious. This guy is preparing to fight. So even though Grant has his reputation and he's going to want to move in the same way, it's going to be difficult for him. And that's going to make the East a little worse than it would have been. Had he brought his whole army from the West to the East, the war would have been over in 64. Because Grant and his army knew what they needed to do. And as you'll see in just a second, they weren't able to pull that off in the East because of the slowness of so many of the of the generals. They just wouldn't act as fast as Grant wanted. So in May, he says, we're going off. One of the things that he said that surprised Lincoln was, I'm not going to stay in D.C. He left Halleck as the kind of quartermaster in charge. And he said, my headquarters is going to be with Meade. Now, this is unfair to Meade, because a lot of times you'll see, in fact, I got a slide in a second, this is Grant versus Lee. It never really was Grant versus Lee officially. It was, of course, unofficially, always Grant versus Lee. But really, Meade was in charge of the Army of the Potomac, the Eastern Army, and Sherman was in charge of the Western Army. And so it's Grant, and then Meade and Sherman. But he's going to stay with Meade. And Grant, to his credit, never gave direct orders. He'd always tell Meade what he wanted, and then Meade would do it. So in the East, he's going to move back to the exact same spot that Hooker had fought the year before. In the West, he's unleashing Sherman. Now, they've got to be successful because all those other generals, again, all those Butler, Sigel, Banks, they were all political appointees. They weren't good generals, and they didn't do a good job. And so they aren't successful in their attacks. But Grant and Sherman will be. Sherman and Grant both understand they need to destroy the Southern will to fight. And the way to do that is to destroy the army in the field. But now there's no reason to have just frontal attacks. So Joe Johnston was a good general, and he knew how to build a defensive flank. But in the vast expanse of all the land up in Chattanooga, and if you guys ever drive between Atlanta and Chattanooga on I-75, this is that road. The road that Sherman and Johnston fought over in early 64 is I-75. And so Sherman would go down, he'd find where Johnston was, and then he would flank him. He'd just go around him. I'm not going to fight you here. The very thing Lee wouldn't do, Sherman did. And so as you can see, all through May, he just keeps backing Johnston up all the way down. Now, finally, on June 27th, Sherman makes one frontal attack that later he said, I don't know why I did that. It was really a bad decision at Kennesaw Mountain. The Confederacy wins that battle, if you want to think of it that way. And so then Sherman's like, yeah, that's ridiculous. And so he just flanks him again. And on July 9th, then Johnston was all the way back in Atlanta. Now, he wasn't completely trapped. They weren't besieged yet, but it's really over. Meanwhile, in the East, Grant's going to do the same thing. Now, it's a little bit more tricky because Lee's a better general than Johnston. And here, as opposed to here, Lee's got a little tighter geographical ground that he could work with and several rivers in Virginia, which would allow him to make it harder for Grant. But the first battle is probably the most important one. It is the Battle of the Wilderness, the Wilderness Battle. It's the exact same place where they fought the Battle of Chancellorsville. They could call it the Second Battle of Chancellorsville if they wanted to. But because it's really part of Grant's overarching campaign against Lee, they just don't. So it's the Wilderness Battle. Again, I told you to go to all the battlefields. I told you if you go to this one, you're not going to see much. It's terrible. It was a horrible battle. Not only was it horrible because the battle itself was bad, but because it only been a year before, actually, yeah, right out a year. So all the men who had been barely, buried, their bodies were decomposing. Rains had washed away some of that. And then later on the 6th, a fire starts because it was actually very dry at that moment. And so there's a fire that rages, and a lot of people die on that battle because they were either suffocated or they burned to death, not because they were killed by enemy fire. In the process of marching into the wilderness, we get our first kind of example of how the Eastern armies and the leaders are struggling. Grant's used to saying, hey, go, let's go. And he's used to Sherman or Sheridan or some of the others, McClernand from his army in the West just doing it. And his soldiers having that kind of personal initiative to press and to make those early attacks. You may remember the Battle of Shiloh. He said, we have to attack first. So 5 o'clock, boom, we're going. Well, he would give orders to these guys. And sometimes it'd be 4, 5, 6 hours before they would move. And they were all afraid of Lee. In fact, I'm going to read to you one more time. This is all from Gene Smith's wonderful biography on Grant. Highly recommend it to you. I know there's some newer ones, but Smith's was so good. That in the middle of the battle here at the Wilderness, one of the former Eastern generals comes in and they're like, oh, this is a crisis we can't look upon. I know Lee's methods. He's going to get us. Grant finally gets up. And Grant, remember, Grant rarely gets perturbed. But Grant almost lost his cool. And he says, I am heartily tired of hearing about what you think Lee is going to do. Some of you almost always seem to think he's suddenly going to turn a double somersault and land in our rear and on both flanks at the same time. Go back to your command general and try to think what we are going to do ourselves to Lee instead of worrying about what you think Lee's going to do to you. And there's a sense in which you can just see the difference between Grant and everybody else. Quit worrying about what may happen from the saintly, all-powerful Lee, and get in there and attack and move when I tell you to move. Well, 2 days later, as you can see from the casualty numbers, you would say, well, Grant lost that battle. And everybody sort of assumed, well, we're going to retreat again like we always did. And of course, they don't know Grant. They weren't with Grant at Shiloh, right? You guys already know where this is going. Grant gives orders to march on the 7th, and when they got to the crossroads, it was to turn south. And the diaries and the reports of so many of the men is that as they were marching and they realized they weren't going to have to retreat, a cheer rose up. The band started playing. See, what had happened over 63 for many of the men in the East was that they realized we were not worse of an army. It's just our generals don't have any confidence. We're always fighting a battle and retreating or not continuing to attack like at Antietam. And they just wanted somebody like Grant to give them the freedom. And once they marched south, they knew they were going to be on the offensive. And Grant said to Lincoln, I'm going to fight on this line all summer long. Because again, I can do the arithmetic. Lee cannot escape. And once this happened, Lee was on the defensive. And so for the rest of May, while Sherman is advancing on Atlanta, Grant is advancing on Richmond. They get stuck around Spotsylvania Courthouse. There's a couple of times at the North Anna River, the Mojave Creek, and then ultimately at Cold Harbor. But through May through June, Grant is keeping up just a consistent battering of Lee. Now, at Cold Harbor, just like Sherman had done at Kennesaw Mountain, he makes one major direct attack that he regretted. And it's the one you can see, he says, I regretted it more than the other I ever ordered. It was a mistake, and he knew it was a mistake. But all along the way, it was clear that Grant was winning in destroying Lee's army. And Lee, if you read Lee's own diaries, he's saying this. We're running out of kind of the energy because they basically fought for the entire month of May. And at the end of this overarching campaign, Grant had lost almost twice as many men. He lost around 55,000 men compared to the Confederacy's 33,000, right? But when you look at the percentages, Grant only lost 45% casualties, whereas Lee lost 51%. And Grant could easily replace all of his losses. Lee couldn't replace any. And by the time you get into the summer, Lee is bringing up old men, my age, 50 and older, right, and young boys to fight. He's lost the ability to have any initiative with Grant, and he knows it, and he's trapped. In fact, he says, if Grant gets down to the James River, it's a siege, and it's all over. And that's precisely where Grant was going to go. And so on the night of the 12th, Grant is able to slip away from Cold Harbor, which as you can see is really right outside of Richmond, and pulls a fast one. The Confederate Army didn't know he was moving. They were so good in their movement at this point that in the next mornings when the Confederacy woken up and there was no army across from them. For the first time since May, they lost contact, and Lee did not know. He's like, well, I don't know where he's going. He assumes he's going to go just south, not thinking that Grant would have the audacity to try to cross the James. The James was a very wide river, and there's no way across, no easy way across. But the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers built pontoon boats, which at that time, it was the longest pontoon boats ever built, and they successfully crossed the river. Now, once again, Grant's betrayed in the sense of pulling off what he wants to pull off, because what he thought was, if I can capture Petersburg, then Lee will not be able to stay in Richmond, because Petersburg, as you can see down here on this bottom corner, see the river going out here, and that's the Appomattox River, which you know that name. Well, that railroad is really the only way to the west. Up here, this railroad is not really going in a west in a way that would help Lee. So if they take Petersburg, then Lee, as far as the army goes, has to go west to get out ahead of Grant, or they're trapped in a siege in Richmond. And as you can see, our old friend Beauregard is here working under Lee. And in his diaries, he writes, had the Union Army at that point, once they crossed the river, and it's led by that same man, Baldy Smith, who we talked about in Chattanooga. So you think he might have done better, but he was somebody who was very cautious. Not as bad as McClellan, but still. Beauregard said if they just marched in, they would have captured the city. And had they captured the city, Lee would have had to retreat. And Grant said the war would have been over a year earlier. When they didn't, again, Grant doesn't get flustered. He realizes, all right, we've got them. They're trapped now. And so they're going to basically have to pull off a long siege. Now, we're almost done. Unfortunately, the press, and particularly in the urban newspapers, which are all controlled by the Democratic Party, the war was over. We had lost. The war was terrible. Grant's a butcher. It's a huge failure. It's a huge failure. Well, clearly, you guys watching the presentation, you can see as a neutral observer, the war is only going the North's way. So when you see that what the evidence is, you just wonder how in the world could the press be saying that? But as we know from our own lives and multiple other scenarios, not only now in 2020, but other politics that you probably followed in your lifetimes, a lot of times the press only says things that they want to say to try to convince people who may not be paying attention. So they needed something that was going to be incontrovertible, that no, actually, we're winning. I mean, even Lincoln, who knew what was going on, had begun to assume we're probably going to lose. And he wasn't despondent. He knew we were winning, but he didn't know a way they're going to be able to convince people of this. Fortunately, Jefferson Davis gets involved. He was so mad at Joe Johnson for retreating. And of course, you would have retreated too if you're Joe Johnson, because Sherman kept flanking you. So he made a change. He replaced Johnson with John Bell Hood, with orders to not sit in Atlanta, but to attack. So this is Hood with an army of 50,000 attacking Sherman's now 80,000. You know how this is going to go, right? It's just all bad. And all of that plays exactly into Grant and Sherman's desires. Attack us. We'll win. You'll lose people. It'll be great. And sure enough, over that next month, with Hood consistently attacking, it weakened the Confederate Army to the point that Sherman was able to slowly squeeze around the city until on the 31st, he finally cut the last railroad line out. Hood then has to evacuate September 1st, and on September 2nd, Atlanta surrenders. At the same time, as you can see there in the smaller print, even though Mobile had not been captured with the initial battle of the plan back in May, Grant had made changes, had talked the Navy into doing it, and Admiral Farragut had also captured Mobile. So now you had Lee trapped in Richmond. Atlanta is in our control. Mobile's in our control. There's no more ports of any size to take. It's over. And now all we have to do is get to the end. And that's what we'll look at next time. We'll wrap it up to some degree. And then we're going to save the assassination for 2 weeks. It's kind of the plan for now. We'll look at the march through the South, what that does for Reconstruction, and how Grant's going to begin to make his way to accomplishing Appomattox. But our focus will be mostly on total war and Sherman's march to the South. It still stuns me when I teach this one, that to think that the press and many people in the North would have told you in even August of '64 that the war was lost, that Lincoln had failed, when clearly all the evidence is to the opposite. But then sometimes politics gets in the way of a lot of different things. Grant has done precisely what he wanted to do, destroy the main armies through simultaneous march. And he pulls that off really well. It's costly, but again, that's the arithmetic that Lincoln knew was on the North side. All right, everybody. I wish there was a chance again to have more questions. Again, as I said before, email me if you have any questions. Let me know if you want to ask anything, and I'll try to answer them next time. And we will be back here next week, same time. I look forward to seeing you guys. I appreciate you guys so much. Thank you so, so much.